forward when clearly there is no social license in BC, contrary to what their motion claims. Honourable Member for Crowfoot.
I think I'm reminded of a little line used in one of my children's favorite movies, The Princess Bride, where this one gentleman says, "I don't think something is what you think it means. I don't think this word is what you think it means." And I think the idea of social license is much the same. I don't think social license to the NDP means what it may mean to the Liberal Party. I'm not certain that social license means to the Liberal Party what it means to Indigenous groups. I'm not certain that social license, but I can tell you that the Prime Minister says that we have social license. I think what governments typically have to look for is, is this going to be in the public good? And I like to define social license very closely connected with public good. We have National Energy Board and other groups look and say, is this environmentally going to have an overridingly negative impact, or is it going to be positive? And if it's a positive good, then we say it's in the public good to do something. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell you that social license allows people to have jobs. It allows union jobs to be working across this country. I'll read you one quick quote from the head of EVRAS North America, Conrad Winkler, has a holding in Camrose and also in Regina. He says this: "Pipeline projects' benefits do not recognize regions or stop at oil field borders. They generate huge benefits for Ontario and Quebec as well, because they provide jobs, property and income taxes, construction activity, and community development." That's Conrad Winkler. Social license, it allows, jobs like this allow social programs like healthcare, education to carry on. I think these jobs are in Canada's best interests.
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure and Communities.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to preface this speech by saying that I will be sharing my time with my honourable sparring partner from St. John, Rossay. Mr. Speaker, I stand here today to address the Trans Mountain Expansion Project. This government has been working diligently to ensure that this important project comes to fruition and bears the promised outcomes of stable, middle-class jobs and security for Canadians. Mr. Speaker, in this country that relies on its ability to sustainably manage its vast natural resources, the Trans Mountain Expansion Project is critical to the Canadian economy and the creation of thousands of jobs. With the continued support of the federal government, as demonstrated by the Prime Minister personally announcing the approval of the project, this project is on track to move forward. My colleague across the way from Red Deer, Lacombe, Alberta, stated on January 2016 that we have not had a very clear signal about what the Liberals are going to do about things like pipelines. One thing they should not do is send a signal to the market that they are going to ban tanker traffic off the West Coast to appease a special interest group which will shut down the Northern Gateway pipeline that would put billions of dollars of Alberta crude into the marketplace, eliminating the price differential that Alberta's captive market currently is in the North American marketplace. Mr. Speaker, my colleagues and I are here today, standing before our colleagues, to assert very clearly that this government intends to make good on its commitments to move forward with the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project. Not
only has this government worked with our Aboriginal partners to find the best way to move forward with this project, but we've also committed to doing it in a sustainable manner. We are determined to protect Canada's coast, which is a source of pride for Canadians, and we are also concerned by all Canadians whose livelihoods depend on waterways and Canada's natural resources. Many jobs supporting middle-class Canadians depend on our ability to manage our resources and to share them with our international trading partners. The extraction of oil is no exception. Even if we are continuing to set up new technologies and new sources of sustainable energy, we still need to participate in the world economy. Canadians, like us, want our vast and beautiful landscapes and ecosystems to continue to be protected. Canadians also understand the importance of economic growth and the ongoing opportunities it presents in terms of jobs. This government will continue to support Canadians in this regard. The regulatory assessment of the Trans Mountain expansion is a joint endeavor by the NEB and Fisheries and Oceans Canada. It aims to implement the Fisheries Act and the Endangered Species Act, combining it with energy regulations. The National Energy Board evaluates potential consequences of these projects on fish habitats, including the habitats of endangered species, in order to ensure that the Fisheries Act and the Endangered Species Act are respected. The government is continuing to support the NEB's 2016 report on this project and its recommendations to expand the Trans Mountain Pipeline project while respecting, of course, the many conditions.
An environmental assessment certificate for the project, subject to an additional 37 conditions. The Liberal Party has been clear, Mr. Speaker, protecting our natural heritage and our oceans is a priority. Canada is a maritime nation with more coastline than any other country in the world. Canadians rely on their coasts and waterways for recreation, to deliver products to the market, and to earn their livelihood, but also cherish them for cultural reasons. All Canadians, and especially coastal communities, need confidence that commercial shipping is taking place in a way that is safe for mariners and that protects and sustains economic, environmental, social, and cultural health of our oceans and coasts. In November 2016, the Prime Minister launched the Oceans Protection Plan. This national $1.5 billion investment will protect Canada's marine environments, improve marine safety, and responsible shipping. It will also provide Indigenous groups and coastal communities with new opportunities to protect, preserve, and restore Canada's oceans and sea routes. The Oceans Protection Plan is an ambitious, whole-of-government approach to oceans management that involves working with the provinces and territories, Indigenous peoples, industry, environmental organizations, and a host of other partners to further protect our coast and waterways in the Atlantic, Pacific, and in the Arctic. This national strategy is creating a world-leading marine safety system that provides economic opportunities for Canadians today while protecting our coastlines and clean water for generations to come. The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Oceans and the Canadian Coast Guard, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, and the Minister of Transport have announced several initiatives as part of the Oceans Protection Plan, and this government is busy implementing those initiatives. One of these initiatives is marine pilotage. Marine pilotage is a service where marine pilots take control of a vessel and navigate it through ports and waterways. In Canada, once a vessel enters into a compulsory pilotage area, under law, the vessel is obliged and obligated to have a Canadian marine pilot guide it and transit through the area. Marine pilotage has a success rate of over 99%, providing Canadians with the assurance that ships in their waters are traveling safely to and from their destinations. Pilotage has a direct impact on significantly reducing vessel accidents such as collisions, power groundings, and drift groundings. Canadians can confidently say that when marine pilots are combined with the use of escort and standby tugs, shipping operations in Canadian waters are very safely conducted. Monsieur le Président,
Mr. Speaker, this government is striking a balance between Canadians' needs today and the right of Canadians to preserve their natural heritage for future generations. There's no doubt that our coastal regions are beloved and are a beloved part of our country, and it's increasingly clear that moving forward with the Trans Mountain expansion was a difficult decision to make. Canadians know and understand that this government is determined to ensure that this is done in a sustainable manner. The decision was made to move forward with this project in a manner that would have the fewest environmental consequences possible. The green light was given to the Trans Mountain project, but that does not mean that this government is not going to try to have an economy that is less based on carbon. We do need to move forward with the Trans Mountain project for economic reasons. We are also pursuing medium and long-term projects that will allow Canada not only to develop sustainable forms of energy, but also to market these forms of energy to our international trading partners. Together, Canadians will be able to ensure that jobs and economic growth will continue to be available for many years to come. Together, Canadians can work to develop these future technologies. Together, Canadians can restore our huge and precious natural heritage. Canada is a proud maritime trading nation, and our ports are increasingly active. As good stewards of our air and water, we have opportunities to meet the challenges faced in our coastal regions by responding to future pressures as well. In the next 50 years, our children and grandchildren will have received a natural heritage that should include clean and safe coastlines. Our children and grandchildren will also be able to benefit from strong education, health, and research programs. The Trans Mountain Expansion project is a contribution that will help meet this future. This government has decided to move forward in a measured fashion with this project, and we are committed to following the project at every step to make sure that developers are respecting all of the conditions. Furthermore, this government is also committed to attract as many investments as possible. As the Trans Mountain Expansion will create direct jobs for the middle class, it will also create other indirect opportunities as well. It will not only produce economic results but these are economic results that we simply can't do without. We need to make responsible decisions about the energy that we consume, and we need to transport it safely to international markets. To do so, we're working on the ground to ensure that the pipelines that we build are safe and made with the latest technology. The Government of Canada has invested in an ambitious ocean protection plan. We are protecting our wildlife and our coastlines, and we are working with First Nations. We are listening to their concerns and using their traditional knowledge. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I see that my time is up, and I'm ready to take questions.
Questions and comments. Commentaire. The Honourable Member for Dauphin, Swan River, Neepawa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to correct the record on some of the statements that some of the previous speakers have made. Under our watch as a Conservative government, most environmental indicators improved in Canada, things like sulfur dioxide, nitrous dioxide, and our freshwater quality was rated number 2 in the industrialized world. So we have a very proud environmental record as a Conservative government. I should also make the point, the Speaker talked about ensuring that pipelines are built to high standards. As somebody who's done environmental assessments of pipelines and has worked in the oil sands directly, one thing I can assure him and all others in this chamber is that every single industrial process and industry in Canada and development is built to the highest standards in the world. That you can be sure of. So to check and recheck that they're doing it right is simply a waste of time in many cases. One thing I found out in my time in the Mackenzie Valley, Mr. Speaker, is that prolonged processes kill projects. I know it's the Liberal Party loves to talk about process after process after process. Well, after 25 years of environmental process in the Mackenzie Valley, there's no pipeline and dozens of impoverished communities. My question to the member, however, relates to national unity. I find it appalling when one province can essentially or want to block the exports of a province inland. When one looks at the ramifications of this, my province exports wheats, grains, and oilseeds, on and on and on. We're an exporting country. What if every province, coastal province, decided that they didn't like a certain product to go through their jurisdictions? The impact on national unity would be horrendous. And I think this project here needs to go through, and BC needs to be told they are part of this confederation, and it is their responsibility to ensure that this pipeline is built and the oil flows.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure I heard a question, but I'm glad to speak on what my honourable member discussed. I think it's. I do not think for a second we should be talking about national unity when it comes to getting our oil to Tidewater. This is a project that is important for Canadians, important for the middle class, important for quality jobs, and important for the economy and the development of this nation as a whole. The idea that one thing for Quebec isn't good for BC or isn't good for Alberta, this pipeline is good for New Brunswick, it's good for Nova Scotia, it's good for every single province in this Confederation, Mr. Speaker, and to make it a national unity debate is both silly and unproductive. This government will take its time. I understand that he's trying to give me assurances, Mr. Speaker, of what they did previously, but 2 years in government, I've realized you need to trust, obviously, but you need to verify, and that's what we're doing. We're doing the checks. We did it properly. We have a number of conditions we impose. We're going to be responsible about it, and we're going to do it in the right way and make sure we have proper jobs for the 21st century. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is indeed a sad day when the Liberal government, including all the MPs from British Columbia on the Liberal side of the House, are standing in unison in support of the Kinder Morgan pipeline. Now, I have a question for this member. This pipeline is slated to go through 15 First Nation reserves, up to 15 First Nations reserves, including the Coldwater Band that has opposed this pipeline and will have vowed to fight this going through their reserve land. Section 78 of the National Energy Board Act says that the federal government can indeed expropriate this land through an order in council. So my question to this member is, will he use this power? Will he help Kinder Morgan expropriate land from First Nations reserves? And further, the National Resources Minister said that he would use the Defence Forces and the Army to get this through our province. Will he indeed back his Natural Resources Minister and agree with that horrible statement? Thank you, Mr.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank the honourable member for his question. I think if you check the record of how this pipeline got approved, we expanded the consultation with Indigenous people. They are entitled to their views. There is a considerable amount of support for the project. This is an important project to get oil to Tidewater. The members on this side of the House are entitled to their opinion. Those from BC are entitled to theirs. They're entitled to advocate within caucus some support, and the record shows that some do not. And this is an open and transparent government, Mr. Speaker, and people are entitled to their opinion. The decision has been taken to approve the project. We will be very careful in how it is implemented, and obviously work with the proponent and all communities that are touched by this in order to make sure this is done in the most effective, transparent, open, and safe way, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for St. John, Rothsay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, let me say how pleased I am certainly to stand and speak on this today. I am a proud member of Parliament from the riding of St. John, Rothsay, a riding, Mr. Speaker, that is highly industrialized, that is home of one of the largest oil refineries in Canada, and a riding that is pinning a lot of hopes on this government, our transparent process, the NEB process, in hopes that Energy East is also delivered to our riding. But, Mr. Speaker, let me say very clearly that Canada has always been a nation with an abundant and thriving natural resource sector, something I think we can all be very proud of. In 2015, natural resources directly and indirectly accounted for 1.77 million jobs in Canada and accounted for 17% of our national GDP. Clearly, responsible resource development is a key plank in our nation's prosperity, Mr. Speaker. On November 29th, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau gave the government's approval for Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Expansion Project. In approving this, the Prime Minister noted that this decision is a major win for Canadian workers, for Canadian families, and the Canadian economy, now and into the future. But, Mr. Speaker, this was a decision that was not taken alone, nor was this decision taken lightly. This project received approval from the National Energy Board, who consulted with numerous stakeholders. Through this process, we believe we have the social license to proceed with this project that falls under federal jurisdiction. While we recognize the need over the coming decades to transition to low-carbon economy, getting the best price in world markets for Canada's natural resources is our priority and critical, Mr. Speaker. It's critical to the economy of our country. Resource extraction, particularly with regards to oil, is a serious matter, and we have worked to ensure that we are taking steps to do this appropriately. As my colleague and friend said in his previous speech, this is not a time for politicizing. It's not a debate on national unity. It's about doing the right thing for our country. On January 25, 2017, my colleague, the Honourable Mark Garneau, outlined our government's commitment to keeping our coastline safe through our ocean.
See the honourable member for Calgary Shepherd rising on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, I hate to interrupt the member's speech, but as the member knows, you can't name another member of this House under our standing orders that we have, so I'd like just the member to correct himself.
Thank the honourable member for raising the point, and I think the honourable member for St. John Rothsay has got the point, and he'll avoid that in the future, I'm sure. Thank you. The honourable member for St. John Rothsay.
On January 25, 2017, my colleague, the Minister of Transport, outlined our government's commitment to keeping our coastline safe through our Ocean Protections Plan. Thank you for that correction to my friend across. This $1.5 billion investment is one example of how we are working to show how a clean environment and strong economy do not have to be mutually exclusive. I think over the past year, Mr. Speaker, we have proven that time and time again. Although this project is federal jurisdiction, all the partners in this project have been working to ensure that it is beneficial to both the environment and the economy. They go hand in hand, Mr. Speaker. However, Mr. Speaker, we believe that this pipeline should be constructed with the continued support of the Government of Canada, as announced personally by our Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've shown the steps we've taken to proceed responsibly. Now let me talk about the economic benefits. This project will bring jobs and economic growth, both during its construction and after completion. Mr. Speaker, what other project will provide 15,000 jobs without government investment? 15,000 jobs that will change communities, change the lives of so many families across this country. This project, Mr. Speaker, will provide $7.4 billion injection into Canada's economy through project spending. Additionally, this project will increase our ability to get our resources to market, resulting in $4.5 billion in tax revenues and royalties for federal and provincial governments to reinvest in critical infrastructure, schools, and hospitals. And the economic benefits for this project are far-reaching, Mr. Speaker. On a large scale, this project will create 15,000 jobs during construction, as I just said earlier, and create 440 permanent jobs per year during its operation. This is a substantial boost to our economy. It's a substantial boost to our country. Canada is committed to strong nation-to-nation relationships, Mr. Speaker, with our Indigenous peoples. In this regard, as this project has been planned and implemented, economic benefits for Indigenous peoples has been a key consideration. Part of the three-member ministerial review panel has been Kim Baird, six-time elected chief of the Tussonan First Nation and a consultant of Aboriginal economics and governance. More than $300 million has been committed to Indigenous groups through this project under mutual benefit and capacity agreements. Additionally, it is anticipated that $4.5 billion in goods and services will be required to construct this pipeline. The Trans Mountain project will ensure that these business opportunities are shared among Indigenous, local, and regional groups. Already, Mr. Speaker, over 2,500 local businesses are taking advantage of these business opportunities. Among those, almost 200, Mr. Speaker, 200 are Aboriginal businesses based in BC, and over 150 Aboriginal businesses in Alberta. Beyond direct economic benefits is the potential for this project to spread them throughout the West, spurring rural economic development. So beyond the overall economic benefits that this project will bring are the benefits that will spread to communities throughout the West, Mr. Speaker. Rural development and Indigenous economic growth are priorities of our government. Western economic diversification Canada is well positioned to hit the ground running to ensure that the West benefits from this project. Through WD, we have been working already with small and medium-sized enterprises, Indigenous groups, and rural communities as part of our mandate. This network of contacts should help us maximize the economic impacts of this project. This government, Mr. Speaker, owes a responsibility to ensure sustained economic growth. We owe a responsibility to our environment and responsible resource development. And we owe a responsibility to the stakeholders, Indigenous peoples, small and medium-sized enterprises, and all those that stand to benefit by ensuring they are best positioned to do so. Mr. Speaker, again, on a more personal basis, being an MP from the riding of St. John Rothsay, I can tell you firsthand the hopes of the construction workers, of our refinery workers, of industries, of support industries that want to see pipelines built, but they have to be built the right way through proper consultation, Mr. Speaker. I believe in our government, I believe in the process, and we are committed to meeting these responsibilities. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Calgary-Shepherd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for his contributions to this debate. And obviously, he and I share one thing, at least in common, is both of us have many energy workers or those working hard to become energy workers in our ridings. I'd like to quote from the agreement signed by the BC Green Party and the BC New Democrats, and I'd like to get that member's view on what the government should do to stop this. And this is what they've agreed to do in British Columbia. Immediately employ every tool available to the new government to stop the expansion of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the 7-fold increase in tanker traffic on our coast, and the transportation of raw bitumen through our province. This is on page 5. So I'd like to hear that member's take on what his government should do to make sure the Kinder Morgan pipeline gets built.
The honourable member for St. John Rothsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my colleague across the House for his great question. I think that our government should do, Mr. Speaker, what any responsible government should do, much like I think the government across the House would also do, is that we have approved the pipeline. We will support the pipeline, and we will do everything in our power to make sure that pipeline moves forward, Mr. Speaker. So thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd just like to pick up on the last question. So this member says his government will do everything it takes to put this pipeline through British Columbia. Now, this pipeline is slated to go through 15 First Nations reserves and 80 First Nations territories without consent. So Kinder Morgan will be applying to expropriate land from these reserves and First Nations territories. The government needs to sign an order in council under Section 78 of the National Energy Board Act in order for these lands to be expropriated through the right-of-way clauses. And I'm wondering if that's what the member means. Does he mean that this cabinet will sign orders to expropriate land from First Nations reserves and First Nations territories? Yes or no? Thank you, Mr.
Honourable member for St. John Rothsay.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's pretty clear that our government has done a lot of consultation with Indigenous groups, with First Nations groups right across the country. And, you know, a relationship with them is about being transparent and open and working with them, Mr. Speaker. I, at times, am puzzled by the party opposites viewpoints. It depends, it seems, in what province they speak and what viewpoint they have. And Mr. Speaker, this isn't the time to politicize this. This isn't the time to put up roadblocks and barriers. Mr. Speaker, this is the time to act as a government for all Canadians and do the right thing for Canadians and back that pipeline. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments. The honourable member. Questions and comments. Yes, any comment there? The honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've gotten to know the member across the way through our work together at Human Resources, and gotten to visit his home province of New Brunswick and experience some hospitality by the member. And somebody that understands that how important oil and gas is to our economy in Canada. But economies, we talk about economies, and it's a lot of the people out there, it's a lot of blah, blah, blah. But what it comes down to is what was just talked about is jobs. And I've talked about it often as a roof over your head and a meal on your table. Can the member opposite just speak to how important it is to people in his riding, how resource development in his province puts food on the table and a roof over people's heads?
Honourable member for St. John Rothsay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my friend and colleague across the House also, and tell him that I respect his work on HUMA too. He's a great member. I agree with what the member said, Mr. Speaker, with respect to how important our natural resources are to the country, how important it is to get those resources to Tidewater. Again, I am in St. John Rothsay. I live it daily, how important the pipeline and getting pipelines built is to our economy. So, Mr. Speaker, you know, I ran in an election against, you know, to be perfectly transparent, a party that said, you know, we will build that pipeline. I ran on, we want to build the pipeline too, but we want to do it the right way through consultation, to being open and transparent. I have faith, Mr. Speaker, that our way will work and we will get our product to Tidewater. I think it's of utmost importance for the country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd just like to let you know, Mr. Speaker, that I'll be sharing my time with the member from Prince George. I would like to talk about our motion today. It's one that, you know, I'm close to, especially in Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies, is oil and gas. We have our own oil up in my neck of the woods. One of my first jobs is working on pipelines up in the north and up in just about 15 kilometers from the Yukon border as a young guy. But I wanted to speak specifically about three particular issues that have been brought up by the NDP specifically, that claims by the leader that the Aboriginals do not support the project. And I'd also like to talk about safety of the project and just safety of oil and gas development in Canada generally. And then thirdly, I'd just like to talk about a little bit of hypocrisy about using oil and yet being in opposition to its development. But let's start off with the Aboriginal support. I have an article here and a person that I've met before, Calvin Halen is his name, from BC, and president of Eagle Spirit Energy Holdings, and he's Aboriginal himself. I'll just read a few quotes from this particular article. The leaders of the First Nations-backed oil pipeline and tanker export proposal off the BC coast are speaking out against legislation introduced last week. This is the legislation, the moratorium. This is what this is speaking specifically about. And they're against the moratorium because they want the benefits of developing resources to their people. To be clear, here's a quote. To be clear, there has been insufficient consultation for the proposed tanker moratorium, and it does not have our consent. And more specifically, Eagle Spirit Energy, an initiative of elected and hereditary chiefs in BC with elected co-chairs from BC and Alberta, we do believe environmental protection and responsible economic development is possible. This ill-conceived legislation, referring again to the moratorium, puts the prosperity and the future of our people, particularly our youth, in jeopardy. And so there it is, Mr. Speaker, in terms of what the benefit is to Aboriginal peoples themselves. And we even saw with other pipeline projects that this government has said no to, had a vast majority of support of Aboriginal communities along that particular pipeline. So to say in a broad statement that all Aboriginal peoples are against oil pipelines is just ridiculous. And I have a lot of friends that I've grown up with in Fort St. John and Dawson Creek who work in the industry, and they absolutely full-on support oil and gas development in our province. And to see the fact that this oil comes from Alberta is irrelevant to us. We see energy as energy, and the capacity to provide clean energy, energy that's produced in the safest manner in the world, and that would be, you name the method, whether it's oil sands, whether it's the pipeline, whether it's shipping it across the ocean. We have the safest regimes in the world on how to actually do that. And I'd actually like to speak a bit about some of the stuff that I've learned as BC Yukon Caucus Chair and as my critic role for Asia Pacific Gateway. We had a presentation from TK Shipping, and these are some of the companies that build double hull tankers and buy them and actually operate them. And at the time that we heard the presentation, there had not been one breach of a double-hulled vessel in the world. And yet we see millions and millions and millions of barrels of oil per day transported across our oceans, and done as a result of to be quite fair, of an incident that happened back in the 80s. It caused the whole industry to change its entire perspective on safety, and it's been dramatically changed. We see the staggering amount of shipments that go on per day of 60 million barrels per day with pretty much without incident. 60 million barrels per day. That's an awful lot of oil going across the ocean without much of an incident. But I just wanted to speak to, you know, as it relates to us in Canada, I'm going to speak about the East Coast here for a minute. And I'm going to quote another article, and this is about, it's actually a great article that I would highly recommend, Sinking the Myth of Dangerous West Coast Oil Tanker Traffic. And the author says it quite well that it's a myth, because it really is. And I'll just quote from him here. Let's start on our East Coast. Transport Canada data shows that more than 1.6 million barrels of petroleum is safely moved from 23 Atlantic Canada ports each day. Another 500,000 barrels per day moves up the St. Lawrence to Montreal and Quebec. Overall, Eastern Canadian ports berth some 4,000, Mr. Speaker. That's not 400 or 40. That's 4,000 inbound petroleum tankers each year without major incidents. And what we're talking about on the East Coast in this particular project, the Kinder Morgan project, we're talking about an increase in tanker traffic. Now listen to this, it's going to be dramatic. Vancouver traffic from 5 per week to 35. So 5 per week to 35. And meanwhile on the East Coast, as I just said, 4,000 inbound petroleum tankers operate each year without major incident. So I guess I just wanted to highlight this. We've seen presentations before where we look at other ports around the world. Again, literally thousands of tankers moving in this harmonious, it's something to watch when you watch it on a graphic, I guess, when you see how many tankers move a day, and do so safely around the world. And we're talking literally of an increase from 5 to 35 per week. So I guess, again, talking about the article, talking about the myth of dangerous West Coast oil tanker traffic, it's exactly that, and it's a myth. But I know my time is getting short, but I just would like to speak to, I guess, an issue that I've seen. I fly back to BC, as most people know. I'm a British Columbia Member of Parliament. We generally fly back on Thursday night. It's a flight from Ottawa to Vancouver, and it sees a lot of other MPs that go back to Vancouver. And those MPs aren't just Conservative MPs. I would like to say that I see a lot of the NDP members of Parliament that get on those airplanes, and guess what goes in those airplanes to fly? It's the product, it's produced from oil, and it's jet fuel. I always found it ironic that the members from the Green Party and members from the NDP get on the same plane I do and protest that very product's development and production. And to me, there's a word, and it's a strong word, it's hypocrisy. There isn't any electric airplanes so far, not that I know of, that can fly across from Ottawa to Vancouver. So to me, a practical approach, this is what I've said to some of the members, wouldn't a practical approach be, we know we need to develop oil and gas, we know we need it. We need it for airplanes, we need it for building smartphones, we need it for everything pretty much in our modernized world. Wouldn't a practical approach be, why don't we develop our resources, but let's do it responsibly? But yet we see from this agreement from the Green Party in BC now and the NDP in BC, this ridiculous agreement that says they'll do their very level best to shut down projects like this, and yet still go to the gas station, take the filler off the pump, and fill their own vehicle with it. That doesn't compute with me. A person of principle is somebody that's going to stand by principles, and I'm not arguing that the principles are there. That's fine, have them, but live by them then. So if you have a principle where you do not support any kind of oil and gas development, then don't use it. I think it's pretty straightforward. If you're going to have that strong position, then do that. But I don't see NDP members from in the chamber here, or members, frankly, from the provincial NDP or the Green Party in this chamber as well, walking back to BC. They get on the same plane where a product made from the very oil from the oil sands, it's turned into jet fuel that powers that plane to fly back to Vancouver and flies that person from Vancouver back to Ottawa. I don't see how they can still do that with a straight face. Another member that I happened to bump into a few times in the lineups to get onto that same plane is a man named David Suzuki. And he's a guy that comes up to our neck of the woods in our riding that tries to stop pretty much any natural resource project that is even planned or thought of in my area of Fort St. John. Again, I always think it's ironic that people, and it's been mentioned before about some of the high flyers, the ones with the big yachts, how somehow they have a conscience now where they're going to say, well, you should shut down just because you know, east coast of Canada, you're fine over there. You can develop it on your side, but we want to keep the west coast of BC as a park for all of us, just to visit once in a lifetime. So anyway, Mr. Speaker, I think I've spoken about it at detail, and I'll look forward to the questions. But I think we need to absolutely support our opposition motion and give credit to some of the speakers on the government side that they are defending the project, and I'll give them full credit for that. We just expect, we want more solid leadership in the province. So when threats like this are made by coalition governments, that the federal government will stand by a decision and make sure it happens. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Question Kamantaya, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate many of the comments, a bit of the irony that the member has pointed out across the way. You know, it's important to recognize that virtually since taking government, we have established through the Minister of Natural Resources and the Cabinet a process that ultimately led to fact-based decisions being made on the approval of pipeline projects. We've seen a government that has taken the issue of consultations very seriously. And when I say very seriously, whether it's provincial governments, Indigenous peoples, and the different stakeholders out there, doing that consultation, working with individuals to advance. Now we have this particular pipeline that has been approved. The Prime Minister has been consistent on it. We understand the value to it, and I would think that it's time that that we look to individuals that can put the party politics to the side. For the sake of our environment and our economy, that we move forward on the project.
The Honourable Member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member across the way to speak to that. I would say, in defence of the National Energy Board, the process that we were involved in before is a very arduous process, and you know the consultation part that really, I remember one project that went through my riding, and 4,000 people presented on that one particular project. There was no lack of consultation. Really, there was probably no oxygen left in the room. There had been so much discussion about the project in the room. So, you know, and in fairness to the member, I know he's trying to defend his new way is better. But frankly, before the system was pretty good, and the National Energy Board does a very rigorous review of projects and rigorously consults with stakeholders along that particular project. And you know, we have no problems with that. We believe in the process, and we believe it should be done for safe natural resource projects to function in this country.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As one of those British Columbia MPs who does rely on airplanes to get to the nation's capital, I firmly acknowledge that we have an economy, we have an infrastructure that is reliant on fossil fuels. I don't think anyone on this side of the House disputes that fact. What we have trouble with is the fact, first of all, the Kinder Morgan pipeline is not going to be servicing the Canadian market. What it's going to be doing is shipping diluted bitumen to markets in Asia. We are basically selling the lowest quality oil possible with no upgrades, with no value added. So I don't see how that does well for the Canadian economy. The other thing, too, is when we talk about a just transition, I still don't know what the Conservatives' plans are. Like, does the member acknowledge that climate change is it's a threat to our way of life in the 21st century? I just don't know what the Conservatives' plans are for a transition. And I proudly stand in this House in support of electrification of the vehicle grid and so on. But, you know, I'll proudly stand and defend that stance because I think that we owe it to our children, to future generations, here now in 2017, to seriously start talking about those things.
Honourable Member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I guess there's a slight disconnect between the federal NDP party and the provincial NDP party, or ND party, however you want to say that. When we see the absolute blockage of every resource project, and let me be specific about natural gas or oil in the province of British Columbia. They haven't said they're willing to talk or discuss about a better way to do it or a more efficient way or a more safe particular way. They are, no holds barred, they're going to block the project. That's what they're saying. So I don't hear that same kind of, and I acknowledge through the Speaker that the member is seems to be more pragmatic. But the party in BC and the party maybe at large here in Ottawa, I don't see them as pragmatic. I see them as absolutely blocking these projects, and that is a big concern to us in our future. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Time for a short question and response. The honourable member for Calgary, Rocky Ridge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll be brief. In your comment, in the comments of both the speaker and one of the earlier interventions, there was talk about processes, and we know that the Liberals are trying to take credit for improvement of the process. Would the member like to comment on the government's apparent decision to move the National Energy Board out of Calgary, and what signal that might be sending to industry and to development at large? Thank you.
Member for Prince George, Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Yeah, I think, thanks for the question from the member. I think the concern is that the different perspective at which projects will be looked at, and it's from either let's look at projects as a glass is half full, let's try and see them proceed, as opposed to let's put up every roadblock in their way type of attitude. Glass is half full, glass is half empty kind of mentality, and that's, I guess, a concern where it's more of a negative process where projects are considered almost as a default no, and then they have to go through this process where they're approved. And I guess that's a concern for us, is that the projects will be told no before they will be told yes. Again, not questioning whether they should be done safely and efficiently and the rest, but a concern definitely that we see some major changes happening to the NEB. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Caribou, Prince George.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's an honour today to stand in the House and speak to this motion. The very first motion that our new official leader of the opposition put forward. I want to thank him for taking a principled stand on an issue that is dearly important to us in the province of British Columbia and indeed all of Canada. And the motion that we're discussing today reads as follows: is that the House agrees that Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Expansion Project has social license to proceed, is critical to the Canadian economy and the creation of thousands of jobs, is safe and environmentally sound, as recognized and accepted by the National Energy Board. And it is under federal jurisdiction with respect to approval and regulation, and it should be constructed with continued support of federal government, as demonstrated by the Prime Minister personally announcing the approval of this project. What we need, Mr. Speaker, right now is a champion, someone who will stand up for safe transportation of our natural resources. And for the people that rely on the natural resource sector, such as the energy sector, and rely on the natural resource sector and on the energy industry to put food on their table and a roof over their head for their families. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, to no one's surprise, our Prime Minister made the announcement, but has been absent on this front, choosing to offer a few platitudes, not from Ottawa, Mr. Speaker, or his riding of Papineau, but from Italy. Given that he personally approved this project and said the following, this is a decision based on rigorous debate, on science and on evidence. We have not been and will not be swayed by political arguments, be they local, regional, or national. Mr. Speaker, you have to forgive us for our cynicism. I'll remind this House that we saw this Prime Minister and his cabinet absolutely and 100% uncategorically swayed and influenced by outside parties with the reversal of the Northern Gateway project. A project, Mr. Speaker, that the economic benefits from it to our First Nations and Métis communities were unprecedented in Canadian history. It was a part for those communities to share in up to 33% of the ownership and control of major Canadian energy infrastructure project. And, Mr. Speaker, the Aboriginal Equity Partners would also receive up to $2 billion in long-term economic, business, and education opportunities for their communities. Mr. Speaker, this is the reason why we're here today, is that we've seen a lot of talk, but we haven't seen the Prime Minister defend it in the province. We haven't seen his 17 MPs defend it in the province of British Columbia. And I would hazard this, Mr. Speaker, the reason why we are sitting today on the verge of provincial collapse, possibly, with the coalition of the BC NDP and the Green Party is because the Prime Minister himself and the 17 BC MPs have refused to come to the province, refused to stand up for these projects that are the lifeblood of our economy. Mr. Speaker, I've listened to this debate intently over this morning. I've yet to hear one BC MP, BC Liberal MP, stand up in support of this project. We've heard great testimony from members from the Liberal side talking about the benefits to their communities on the East Coast, but yet we have yet to hear one BC MP stand up in this House today and stand up in support of the Kinder Morgan project. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to talk a little bit about the economic benefits of this project. I think a lot of the facts have already been said, but I also want to tie it to really what it means to those communities like my communities in Caribou, Prince George. But I'm going to first go back to this. The benefits of the Kinder Morgan project will provide Canadians incredible economic impact or economic benefits. The National Energy Board released its report on Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline Twinning Project on May 19, 2016. After thorough review of the board approved the pipeline, concluding that subject to 157 conditions, the pipeline was not likely to cause significant adverse environmental effects, and that the construction of the pipeline was in the best interest of the public of Canadians. I'll repeat that one more time. It was in the best interest of Canadians. Kinder Morgan was approved after rigorous, independent, scientific review process. It will create 15,000 well-paying jobs, well-paying, high-quality jobs for Canadians. More than $300 million has already been committed to Indigenous groups by the proponent under mutual benefit and capacity agreements. Over 40 letters of support from First Nations communities along the pipeline have been given to the proponent, and this government knows that, Mr. Speaker. Shovel-ready pipeline projects can see people gainfully employed for 2 to 3 years during the project's construction phase. And finally, Mr. Speaker, since it's FCM week on the Hill and many of our colleagues are actually touring around our mayors and our councillors and our directors from regional districts, I want to make this very clear. Municipalities across Canada receive more than $600 million in property taxes each year from pipeline companies. Those sound like some pretty good benefits, Mr. Speaker. Now, the Prime Minister has made this case for the pipeline in Calgary, which is, I would say, probably a pretty willing and supportive audience. In Rome, which, what are they going to do? They're going to support it. But his BC caucus has been afraid to have him discuss it in the province of British Columbia. He's refused to come and actually speak to the merits and the benefits of it in the province. And Mr. Speaker, it's interesting too. He'll come to the province when he's standing beside third parties, when he's making an announcement of a tanker moratorium or the Ocean Pacific protection plan, when he's doing things that are going to, I guess, unfairly in many ways, unfairly because we're not seeing it on the East Coast, he'll stand beside these third parties and proudly make that announcement of those measures, but he won't stand up when we're talking about something that impacts so drastically our economy of the province and indeed our country. Mr. Speaker, in these times of economic uncertainty, it's imperative that we recognize the importance of our energy and our resource sector, something this government seemingly has failed to do. I hate to be the one to break it to the Prime Minister, but that is part of his responsibilities, Mr. Speaker. It is outlined in his job. He is to be the champion of our resource development, of our energy sector, of our softwood lumber industry, our forestry industry. And I suggest it is now up to Justin Trudeau to walk the talk, stand up for his BC Liberal MPs, and champion the pipeline.
Order. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I apologize for interrupting, but I'm sure the honourable member intended to say Prime Minister and not his proper name.
I thank the honourable member for Senator Gulf Islands for her intervention. In fact, she's right. In fact, we had one of these just in the last hour, as a matter of fact. So these things do happen, and I'm sure the honourable member for Caribou Prince George will prevent that kind of thing from happening for the remainder of his comments. The honourable member.
Colleague is listening so intently to my speech. Mr. Speaker, it is now up to the Prime Minister to walk the talk, stand up to his BC Liberal MPs, and champion the pipeline in BC to ensure that it actually gets built. Because it isn't a single region that will benefit from this project, it is all of Canada. When we create jobs, the benefits are felt by all, from the mom and pop grocery stores to the gas stations where people fuel up in the morning. I think sometimes politicians forget to include this in their vision when they're talking about resources, be it softwood lumber or the creation of future pipelines. I know that in my riding, we're going to face hundreds, if not thousands, of job losses as a result of this government's failure to secure a new softwood lumber agreement. When the energy sector took a hit the last few years, it was a very difficult time for my constituents and indeed all across Canada. We all had acquaintances, friends, or loved ones who had been impacted negatively or lost a job. Even our airlines took a hit with direct flights cancelled between Calgary, Prince George, Terrace, Brandon, Manitoba, Penticton, Kamloops, Abbotsford. It was a huge hit, Mr. Speaker, given that a daily round trip and domestic service into an airport into a small community roughly the size of Prince George generates $2.5 million in value-added GDP and $5.8 million in economic impact. Mr. Speaker, we're not just talking about a pipeline. We're talking about Canada's economy. We're talking about the government, this Prime Minister, and his 17 BC MPs standing up for a project that is so vital for not just the province of British Columbia, for all of Canada. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm privileged to be able to put a question to my friend from Caribou Prince George, and he is my friend. I don't say that merely out of niceties. We're friends. But I don't agree with him that this project is in the national interest. And in fact, I think it's important for Canadians to know that when the National Energy Board reviewed the Kinder Morgan project, they refused to hear evidence from Unifor, the largest union representing workers in the oil sands. They refused to hear evidence from Unifor because the National Energy Board ruled that jobs in the economy were outside their mandate in reviewing the project. So it can't be said that the economic impacts of this project have been reviewed. Now, it's interesting to know that what the Unifor wanted to present to the National Energy Board was evidence that the Trans Mountain Pipeline, Kinder Morgan's expansion, would hurt Canadian jobs, would cost us Canadian jobs. And this is why, and I want to ask my honourable colleague, if he doesn't agree with me, that we should follow the plan for expansion in the oil sands, the plan for development of the oil sands that came from Peter Lougheed. That was the era where the idea was put forward that Alberta's economy would benefit from mining bitumen and processing it in Alberta. The reason it will cost Canadian jobs, according to Unifor, is that shipping out raw bitumen to refineries in other countries will hurt Canadian jobs and will actually lead to the closing of the Chevron refinery in Burnaby because they do not have the capacity to process raw bitumen. Why do the Conservatives prefer creating jobs in other countries to refineries in other countries rather than process the material and create jobs in Alberta?
Honourable member for Caribou Prince George.
Well, I thank my honourable colleague for her question, and as she mentioned, she is a friend, and from time to time, her interventions are interesting. They're well thought out, and always enjoy hearing her in the House, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, look, I can't speak to the comments that Unifor said and their position on Kinder Morgan. Not going to talk to that. I woefully and vehemently dispute our honourable colleague's assertion that we're all about shipping jobs overseas. The Conservatives are all about shipping jobs overseas and closures and whatever that question was insinuating, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives are all about free trade, and making sure that our suppliers, our producers within Canada are able to access every market possible, creating jobs, not just jobs, but great paying jobs right here in Canada to ensure that our products get to market, whether it is home or abroad. Conservatives are all about.
Questions and comments? Question commentaire. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as I've indicated earlier, you know, we as a government have moved forward on the issue of pipelines, being very sensitive to the economic issues, the environmental issues,